As previously mentioned, proximal processes are heavily influenced by person characteristics of the developing individuals of interest and of any people with whom they are interacting. But they're also heavily influenced by the context, or, as Bronfenbrenner wrote, quote, the environment, both immediate and more remote, in which the proximal processes are taking place, end quote. It is unfortunate, but Bronfenbrenner is most widely known as a theorist of context. Having used the metaphor of Russian nesting dolls to describe the individual embedded within multiple levels of context, his theory is typically described as being one that deals with the influence of context on the individual. In fact, as we've discussed, context is merely one of the elements of the PPCT model, a model in which proximal processes are of most importance. Of the 4 levels of context about which Bronfenbrenner wrote, the microsystem is the most important, as proximal processes only occur within these immediate environments of the microsystems. The microsystems are environments in which the developing individual of interest, for example, a child, is going to have the opportunity for face-to-face contact with others and to be active with objects or symbols for significant portions of time. For an early childhood educator, the classroom is going to be an important microsystem to consider. How that classroom environment is organized, the types of activities and interactions that are encouraged and disencouraged, how calm or chaotic things are, and so on, all are likely to influence the manner in which children engage in activities and interact both with their peers and their teachers. In other words, are likely to influence proximal processes. It is easy to see how this could be true by thinking about one classroom in which children are expected to sit at individual desks while their teacher talks and occasionally poses questions, and another classroom in which the activity areas are set up, with children choosing which of the areas to be in, and the teacher going around to different areas to talk with small groups about what they're learning. Children develop in more than one microsystem, of course, and Bronfenbrenner used the term mesosystem to describe the relations between 2 or more microsystems. The child's home is the obvious example of a microsystem, but if children spend a good deal of time also at their grandparents' house, or with a peer group, these also would count as different microsystems. The home context is most important, assuming the child spends most time there, because how that environment is organized will influence the ease with which children make the transition to a new classroom in a childcare center or a school, for example. Children coming from homes in which they are expected to carefully follow directions, obey their parents and other adults, and stay neat and clean would be most likely to find it easier fitting into the first classroom described above. By contrast, children who have become used to having to decide many things for themselves and to learn to exercise autonomy are more likely to fit into the second type of classroom described. Mesosystem analysis helps us to understand why a child from the first type of home might find it difficult to engage in productive proximal processes in the second type of classroom, and vice versa. This is not to say that Bronfenbrenner thought there needs to be a close fit between different microsystems in order for children to succeed. In fact, it is clearly helpful for children to learn that different types of environments require different types of behavior and afford the learning of new roles and new ways of acting and interacting. The exosystem, in Bronfenbrenner's typology of context, is a setting in which the developing individuals of interest are not situated, but which nonetheless has an important indirect effect. In the case of a child, an important exosystem would be a parent's work situation, or what is happening in the teacher's home. Think of parents whose job requires them to carefully do all that their immediate supervisors ask them to do, and for whom success at work means being punctual, always looking neat and clean, and following the rules that others have laid down. Given that this type of job typically may not require much, if any, education beyond high school. Such parents are likely to have viewed school success also in terms of doing what the teachers want. Given their views of what is necessary for success, whether at school or work, it's not surprising at all to find that they are likely to value obedience in their children as a way to achieve later success. By contrast, parents who during their education have been encouraged to think for themselves, typically in the course of higher education, and whose job also requires them to exercise self-direction, or more likely to value autonomy in their children. The experiences that parents have had in their earlier education and are currently having at work, settings in which their children are not situated, are thus likely to have influential, indirect effects on the way in which they typically deal with their children at home. Effects, in other words, on proximal processes. Similarly, if a teacher is facing family problems at home, or is getting insufficient sleep because her child is ill or not sleeping well, this will have an influence on the proximal processes in which she is involved with the children at school. If the teacher is the developing individual in whom we are interested in, the homeschool issues are related to the mesosystem. However, if our developing individuals of interest are the children in her class, the indirect effects on proximal processes related to what is happening in the teacher's home count as an exosystem effect. The final aspect of context is the macro system, which Bronfenbrenner conceived of as akin to culture, whether considered as an entire society or a racial, ethnic, regional, or socio-economic group within a society. A macro system includes people who share values, beliefs, practices, access to resources, and a sense of common identity. People living in the United States can be distinguished in these terms from those living in Russia. These two countries constitute two different macro systems. Within the United States, however, if members of two racial ethnic groups or two socioeconomic groups or two groups living in different regions can be differentiated in terms of their values, beliefs, practices, and sense of identity, they also count as different macro systems. One should not be surprised to find, then, that members of these different within U.S. macro systems have different child-rearing values, beliefs, and practices. If middle-class parents are more likely than their working-class counterparts to value the ability of children to make their own decisions, and working-class parents more likely to value following the rules that others have laid down, for the reasons mentioned previously, and they spend more time in the company of their parents from the same socioeconomic background, it should not be surprising to find that these ideas become more solidified. If their own parents are also from a middle-class background, and this is their experience of being raised, again, they may be more likely to have taken on these same values. Then, to the extent to which parental practices, proximal processes, in other words, are in line with their values, middle-class parenting practices should be different from those found among working-class parents. In other words, parents' values are not simply the product of their own personal characteristics, but reflective, in part, of the macro systems of which they are a part. In this sense, the choice of childcare center or type of school is not simply a personal choice, but stems, at least in part, from the values and beliefs shared by the cultural group of which the parents are a part. Access to resources, one of the most important components of the macro systems, also is clearly important in this choice. Some childcare centers situated in affluent areas are able to charge high prices, and thus may have better quality materials, equipment, smaller class sizes, better paid employees, and thus probably better trained educators than do children in childcare centers situated in poorer areas. Similarly, School districts in affluent suburbs typically can provide so much more for their children than school districts in rundown areas of cities or in impoverished rural areas. The macro system thus influences proximal processes in many ways, including the ways in which parents interact with their children and, through the choices that they make with regard to childcare and schooling, how children are likely to interact with teachers and peers in school. Time is the fourth and final aspect of the PPCT model and can be thought of in two different ways. The first is that cultural values, beliefs, and practices are not static, but change over time. Whether children are expected to go to school at all, the age at which they should go, and how long they should stay in school, and the ways in which they are treated while in school, have all changed dramatically over the past several centuries, and changed considerably from one generation to the next. These types of changes clearly have implications for proximal processes, or what is expected to go on in childcare or school. The second way has to do with what is occurring over time within any given proximal process. For example, when a teacher and child are interacting, is the former's attention completely on the child, or is the teacher's attention divided between this specific child and the other children in the room? Proximal processes, Bronfenbrenner argued, will be far more effective in the first than in the second case. Second, how often does this teacher interact with the child? If the proximal processes are to be effective, they must occur regularly and with increasing complexity. A single interaction once a month is unlikely to be helpful. Bronfenbrenner was also clear that if one wants to study development, one has to study development over time. Cross-sectional studies, while adequate to show that children differ in cognitive abilities or social emotional understanding at different ages, can never answer the developmental question of how development occurs. Just as teachers see how their children develop over the course of the school year, so researchers also need to conduct longitudinal research to understand development.